If you play video games and you were asked who these guys were, it's basically borderline guaranteed that you would know who they are or at least what game they're from. Enemies are an iconic part of video games, mainly because they tend to be your main obstacle throughout the entire game. In many cases, thankfully, there's tons of video games that gave us a bunch of enemies with loads of personality and charm. One example of a series with charming enemies is Mega Man, which I absolutely plan to cover in the future. But for today, I thought it would be fun to rank every enemy and boss in one of my all-time favorite games for the Super Nintendo. Super Castlevania IV. Across the entire Castlevania series, there has been tons of wacky and fun enemies to fight, and Castlevania IV is no different. I want to rank these enemies based off their design, attack pattern, and how interesting the idea of said enemy is. While I may reference previous or future iterations of an enemy, I will be ranking the Castlevania IV iteration specifically. So while it's cool some enemies got upgrades later on, they will not count towards my ranking for this video. I also want to mention that to make things a bit more organized, I have categorized every enemy into a certain group. So as I go along the tier list, I will be going group by group to keep things efficient. So with that said, let's see the creepy and silly creatures that go bump in the night within Super Castlevania IV. The first group that we're going to talk about are the ghost or haunting figures. These enemies are spirits, often in the form of tortured souls or possessed objects. The most simple among this group being the literal ghost enemy. These little guys have been haunting around since the original on the NES, and usually take the form of a skull or skeletal creature surrounded by fire. Sometimes they do tend to do a bit more drastic changes, cause like, look at the one in Haunted Castle, this shit is crazy. In each game they slowly spawn in and make a beeline for the player. With 1 or 2 hits, they're usually down for the count. In Castlevania IV, this also applies. Their design is more on the beige side, and they don't appear too often. Given how simple this enemy is, despite the nice design, when compared to the later enemies we will see, the ghost finds its way right into C tier. Next up is this guy. Yeah, you know, this iconic Castlevania enemy. This is the Ectoplasm. If you played Symphony of the Night, then this may sound very familiar. The Ectoplasm in Castlevania IV is the very same one that appears in Symphony of the Night, although with a much more basic design and concept. Super Castlevania IV is actually where these guys make their debut. In this game, they are blobs of light constantly changing color. They fly around trying to kill Simon, and after some whipping, they expand like MS Paint and disappear. The original design doesn't compare to the later iterations, that's a given, but to give any credit, I do like the odd charm of how weirdly out of place this enemy feels. I also like the MS Paint death animation. When getting hit in Castlevania IV, you don't undergo a curse like future versions of this enemy, though they are a lot faster and harder to hit compared to future titles. I think the Ectoplasm's first go around in Castlevania is pretty nice. They're unique and they have charm, but nothing too insane. Maybe this is me giving more praise than needed, but I think the Ectoplasms honestly earn a B tier. They also get bonus points because the colors make me think of Chromastone from Ben 10. One enemy, or should I say 2 enemies that I really like the concept for, is the Dead Nobleman and Dead Noblewoman. Not so much for their basic variations as they just make a beeline for you and don't do much beyond that, with the only difference being that the 2 of them have different attack patterns and the Noblewoman has more health. However, I love the ghost dancers. Something about a dead couple dancing passionately while also trying to kill you is just so neat to me. This is something more emphasized with a boss encounter, but that's for later on. And as you would expect, in later games like Aria of Sorrow, they're given more interesting designs that I really like. I do want to mention that in Castlevania IV, their artwork is actually pretty interesting. I love that it almost looks as if they're wearing a mask. Given they're dead, they don't have a face as the windows to the soul, aka the eyes, are gone. The Dead Nobleman and Noblewoman can get a B tier, mainly on the principle that they're more interesting than the basic ghost. And for the ghost dancers, I honestly want to give them S tier. I just genuinely really love the idea behind this enemy. I mentioned that the ghost category included haunted objects. These objects are the Ouija table and the grabbing portrait. The Ouija table is a pretty neat idea for an enemy. It's a table that you think is just there for decor and then BAM! It jump scares you. This enemy also received an upgrade in terms of its design, as in Haunted Castle, it was just known as Poltergeist and it was just a few small objects as opposed to a whole table. And I do want to mention that in later games, like Rondo of Blood, it's a fucking sword on some hone-edge shit. Moving on to the grabbing portrait. I really like the idea behind a living portrait that tries to strangle you. Stage decor and background elements being potential hazards is something I find interesting, so I'm glad that Castlevania IV has a take on it. This design also gives me Courage the Cowardly Dog vibes, which is a huge plus. In a way, this enemy is kind of like a precursor to the enemy you see in Rondo of Blood, which is also a haunted portrait. Both enemies do act very differently. While Castlevania IV is a stationary hazard, in Rondo of Blood it's an instant kill if it touches you, with its own custom death animation. But the Castlevania IV variant of this enemy is still pretty cool. My only nitpick is that I'd like it if not every portrait was an enemy. That way they can keep you guessing if a portrait's gonna try to strangle you or not, adding a bit to the horror aesthetic that this this game has going for it. The Ouija table can get a B tier. I was considering C tier, but I genuinely do like the jump scare element that this enemy has. The grabbing portrait will be getting an A tier. It's a really fun type of hazard that we don't see much of in Castlevania. The final enemy for the ghost category is the Dead Mate. Now if you play normally, you may never see this man in your entire playthrough. That's because he's located in a secret room in stage 6. When you enter the secret room, his pet dog will fly around and constantly attack you. Killing this dog will cause the man to walk slowly and stop at the dead dog. He cries and mourns for his pet, and then just disappears. The craziest part about this is that the Dead Mate himself cannot attack you, and you can't attack him either. You just kill his dog for the love of the game. We even see something similar later on in Symphony of the Night with the Owl Knight, although this enemy is way more malicious. This enemy deserves an S tier just because this is the first instance of really getting extra detail from an enemy in the Castlevania series. It's also just a really sad enemy, but still interesting, so I think it deserves credit for that. The Dead Mate isn't the only enemy to have a dog, as Castlevania IV gives us 2 dog enemies for the dogs group. We have the Zombie Dog and the Candle Hunter. The Zombie Dog is essentially the Panthers from Castlevania 1, although they can't despawn off screen like their 8-bit counterparts. They can't be killed by normal means and constantly get back up after one strike. The Candle Hunters are a much more interesting take on an enemy as they don't go after you. As their name implies, they actually target the candles. This means that they could potentially make you lose out on hearts, sub-weapons, or chicken to heal with. I like the interesting idea for an obstacle other than an enemy simply trying to kill you. The Zombie Dog gets a D since they're pretty uninteresting and just a copy of a previous enemy. As for the Candle Hunters, they should honestly get A tier, mainly because the added challenge for losing a collectible is pretty cool. The next group of enemies that we have is the Jumping Critters. Small or hard to reach enemies that jump and attack Simon relentlessly. The first one we're going to talk about is the OG for that archetype, the Gremlin, looking a little less hunchbacky than usual. That's because the design in Castlevania IV is based off the Japanese design. I also want to talk about how the alternative name for this enemy is the Ghoul Rabbit, but it doesn't feel as iconic as Hunchback or Gremlin. They do their usual jumping action, but with multi-directional whipping and the whipped angle, they're nowhere near the menace that they were in the previous games. The Japanese design being seen in other versions of the game is nice, but that doesn't really help much, so they're gonna get a C tier. Next we have your basic ass frog. The frogs tend to be considered hard to deal with, which I never got. You can hold your whip out and they just can't hurt you at all in the slightest. This enemy debuted in Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse. They also appear as enemies in Konami YY World where they what the fuck? This enemy isn't terribly interesting, so it's gonna get a D tier. The last enemy for this group is the Merman. Even though this isn't the goated Bloodlines design, I still enjoy the Mermans as enemies here. They jump and spit out their water, usual Merman action, though I do prefer the diagonal attack as opposed to the usual horizontal one. I like them enough, so they're gonna get a B tier. Castlevania IV has enemies that move around plenty, but what about enemies that just want to stay in one place to fuck you up? That's where the stationary enemies come in. This group contains enemies either remaining in one set location or moving in a single pattern and never deviating from it. First off is the Oon, an evil plant that stays in one place to stop Simon in his path. The sprite work is nice and all, but that's all it really has to offer. As far as actually being an enemy, it goes into F tier, but at least it does get a substantial upgrade in its next appearance in Symphony of the Night. Well, most of you anyway. Next up is the Giant Spider. This enemy travels up and down shooting a small spider at Simon. The axe is especially good against them, and they don't do much beyond that. Their only real interesting appearance is in Castlevania II, Belmont's Revenge. They leave their web behind upon death, and then Christopher can climb it like a rope. They get a C tier since bug enemies, at least in the earlier games, weren't too common. Then we got the Fuzzbuster. Think like the hotheads from Super Mario World. They even have a face in Kid Dracula. You can hit the Fuzzbuster to slightly slow them down, but they can't be killed. They at least add a challenge to the timing of platforming. They're also a reference to, I'm probably gonna butcher this, but I think it's pronounced Kisaran Pasaron, but I might be wrong on that. Creatures from Japanese folklore, though it's supposed to give you good luck and happiness, not knock back into a bottomless pit, especially if it's this pit. Interesting lore. Okay obstacle, I think it deserves a C tier. Originally I wasn't going to include the statue in this video because it was only a stage hazard, but since the grabbing portrait counts as one, I might as well include the statue too. Plus I learned that the statue is by technicality a recurring enemy. It makes its first appearance in Haunted Castle, where if you approach it, it will crumble and try to attack you. The most interactive of the appearances of the statue is in Castlevania Chronicles, where archer statues will shoot arrows at you, depending on your positioning. In Castlevania IV they behave just like in Haunted Castle. I like their design and the fact that they're called Rolling Stones in this game, which is pretty funny, so I'm going to give this one a B tier. The last enemy for this group is the Dryad, and I love this enemy's design. This creature also just looks like a body that's inside out, which is very fitting for Castlevania enemy design. Like the Ouija table, there's a jump scare element for this enemy, but it's better implemented here since he emerges out of a wall. Check out its design for their first game, Haunted Castle, and also the one for Aria of Sorrow. Like, this is an easy S tier. Sick design, fun enemy that isn't spammed too much to feel less special. I love the Dryad. With all the stationary enemies I talked about, longtime Castlevania fans may have noticed that I intentionally left out one of the most recurring stationary enemies that's been around since the original NES game. That's because I think it fits better for our next group of enemies, which is the Bone Zone. Enemies that are skeletons or just made of bones. First off, we have the regular skeleton. They usually just walk back and forth, so they're basically the Koopa Troopa of the Castlevania universe. And while it's unrelated, their animation in Haunted Castle fucking kills me. There's variations of the skeletons, such as the Bone Chucker. Think sort of like the Hammer Brothers, but not as difficult to deal with thanks to Simon's arsenal. They can be a bit tricky depending on positioning. I'm looking at you, Chronicles. But then you could just fuck with them like this. Now I'm over here. Oh, now I'm over here. Wait, but now I'm over here. Actually, I'm over here. To keep the Mario comparisons going, blood skeletons are basically the dry bones of Castlevania. You can hit them over and over, but they always get back up. They're not too bad to deal with unless they're above you with staircases. Once again, looking at you, Chronicles. But they're still pretty neat enemies. Then there's also the Whip Skeleton, mimicking your whip attack. It's sort of like a precursor to the Simon Skeleton in Harmony of Dissonance. It's a charming idea, but doesn't lead to much. The Skeletal Knight is a similar deal. They're more aggressive than the other skeletons, so they may get a pot shot, but they're not too difficult. Headless Hunters also appear in this game. Unlike their debut in Castlevania III, they're somewhat slower. They only appear in the final stage and are somewhat awkward to hit only because of their placement combined with stairs. Then there's the Bone Dragon, which is awesome. They've been around since the NES game, and their design is so sick. They can take a beating but also grant you tons of hearts as a reward. The stationary skeleton enemy I was alluding to is the Pillar of Bones. They have also been around since the NES game. In the original, they were annoying to kill because if you didn't have cross equipped, they took too many hits to get rid of. In Super Castlevania IV, however, they're easy pickings. A few whips, throw a cross or two, and they die before they even shoot a projectile. You should never really get hit by these enemies since if you just hold your whip out, their projectiles can't harm you. While their appearance in Castlevania IV is fine, later games will do more interesting stuff with them, like having them hang on ceilings or breathe streams of fire, or just having the Pillar of Bones be taller in general. The last of the skeletons is my favorite, the Hanging Skeleton. Just a silly guy waving his arms around like I do whenever I see Hannah on screen in Adventure Camp. They were only in Castlevania IV up until Castlevania the Arcade many years later, so I hope they make a comeback in a new title at some point. The regular skeletons get a B tier because they're fine for what they are. The Bone Chuckers are in the same boat. I do love that thanks to their attack pattern, it can help you utilize sub-weapons like the axe more efficiently, but that's all they really have going for them. Whip Skeletons are cool in the fact that it's like they're giving you a taste of your own medicine. If it was the Simon Skeleton, it would be an easy S tier, but since it isn't, I think they get an A to be honest. Skeletal Knights also get an A tier. I love their design and their aggressive attack pattern. Blood Skeletons are gonna get an A tier. The only thing really bad about them is their placement depending on the game. Headless Hunters are sort of an afterthought in Castlevania IV, so they're gonna get a C tier. Bone Dragons are easily an S tier. They can be seen as pace breakers, but I like to see them more of just being able to turn your brain off and attack non-stop for a second amongst all the challenge. Pillar of Bones are a C tier. I like them, but they're just that, a pillar of bones. And finally, the Hanging Skeleton should surprise no one when I say it's an S tier. It's just a silly guy enjoying the afterlife. How can I not love him? So we talked about Ghost, and we talked about skeletons. Now it's time to talk about the other undead enemies we have, which are the restless. Essentially, the zombies. We have the zombie and the ground zombie, which are practically the same in this game, the only difference really being their artwork and design. If skeletons are the Koopa Troopas of Castlevania, then the zombies are the Goombas of Castlevania. No matter the game, all they really do is head towards you from left to right. You whip them once and they're dead. The only difference between the zombie, which is known as Cruella in Castlevania IV for some reason, and the ground zombie, is the fact that the ground zombie emerges from the ground, while the Cruella just spawns in. Although check out the artwork for Cruella, this shit is fucking insane. It reminds me a lot of the director from Courage the Cowardly Dog. That's the second time I referenced that show in this video. I also decided to include the Snapper Casket in this category considering that zombies and corpses are just found in coffins. The caskets seem like background objects, but once you pass them, they'll make a beeline for you. They're not too hard to deal with, though I do want to mention that in the Japanese version of the game, they have a cross, which I think adds a nice touch to the design. Both zombies are going to get a C tier. They're your most average enemies in all of Castlevania. The Snapper Casket's going to get a B tier. While the casket is a one-trick pony, I think there's potential for more interesting variations of this enemy later down in the series, which we do see in games like Circle of the Moon. Next we have aerial enemies. Enemies that fly around attacking Simon, usually in a set pattern. The most known flying enemy in Castlevania, or at least one of the most known, being the Bat. Bats have been around since the original NES game. They're small but only go after you directly, so they can be whipped at a distance. Unless it's those occasions where they're in groups, they're pretty easy to deal with. The crow is a similar case, but they curve towards you back and forth. They can be killed before their pattern begins, which is the easiest way to deal with them. Then you got the Medusa head, usually notorious for being in long hallways and hard to avoid. In Castlevania IV, they can be killed no problem thanks to the whip dangle. The rotating room in the Clockwork Mansion becomes a total cakewalk thanks to this technique. The Harpies also appear in this game, dropping off gremlins just like in Castlevania 1. They're big targets and they don't really make an effort to attack you directly, so they're not that challenging. They also have one of my favorite death animations in Bloodlines. And something I never noticed until I was on the Castlevania wiki is that whenever a Harpy loses its head, if it's not dead yet, it will still fight, which is crazy to think about. I also find it kind of funny that you can see their nipples in their sprite work. Then you got the Fire Eye, basically a poor man's peeping eye. They fly, stop, shoot, and then they rinse and repeat the pattern. The Gargoyle and its skeleton variant are also pretty neat enemies. They both behave the same, but their difference in difficulty is their enemy placement. The Gargoyle's pretty simple as they're usually below them or at the same level, but the skeleton Gargoyle is a pain in the library stage if you're not careful when descending down all those stairs. Speaking of libraries, our last aerial enemy is the Spellbook. While it doesn't have any of its cool animations from Symphony of the Night, they're still pretty neat in Castlevania IV. They're like the Fire Eyes, but a little harder to hit due to their placement. The bats are gonna get a B tier. I like bats, but the simple bat enemy is only higher than C due to its iconic status. Crows are gonna get a C tier. Bird enemies in Castlevania for the most part don't tend to do anything interesting. Fire Eyes are a C tier. Ironically, you don't see them often enough to be interesting. The Harpies are usually pretty interesting enemies, but they're just Ubers in Castlevania IV, so they're gonna get a C tier. The only thing stopping them from being D or below is the fact that their design usually carries. The Gargoyle and its skeleton variant are pretty cool enemies, but the Gargoyle itself is only getting a B for being above average. I really like the skeleton Gargoyle, and I think I'm going to give it an A tier, but only a low A since the design is pretty cool, but I wish their placements were better. The Medusa head is going to get an A tier, mainly for their ties to Medusa. And as for the Spellbook, I love the concept, but they don't have any of the interesting stuff from later games. It's not a fair comparison, I know, but with just Castlevania IV in mind, I can only give it a B tier at best. Not only do we have enemies that excel in the air, but what about the enemies that excel on the ground? That's where the sturdy soldiers come in. Enemies that are slow and durable. The Axe Knight and Spear Guards usually being the main ones you see in various titles. Axe Knights throw axes like the cross sub-weapon, and utilizing your whip to nullify them is essential to dealing with them. The Spear Guards are interesting in that not only do they attack horizontally, but also vertically. A pain in games like Dracula X, but in Castlevania IV, multi-directional whipping makes them a non-issue. Mudmen and Golems are pretty similar in design. Mudmen duplicate into smaller entities as you hit them, and they make the game lag, which is appropriate since I suppose you're supposed to feel like you're walking in mud against them. Golems, honestly, like the Headless Hunters, feel like an afterthought. Them emerging from the wall is pretty cool, but they're only in the final stage of the game. They clearly should have been better used in an earlier stage to have a similar method of attack and placement like the Dryad. Axe Knights are gonna get an A tier. I love something about their design and attack pattern, it just resonates with me. Spear Guards are a B tier. I like them in this game, but they don't feel as iconic as later titles. Mudmen might be a hot take, but I always did really love the concept for this enemy, so I'm gonna give him an S tier, but a very low S tier compared to the other ones. Either way, I just really fuck with them. Golems have never been terribly interesting with the exception of bosses like Haunted Castle, and given they're only in the final area of the game before the boss encounters, they're okay, but sadly in comparison to other enemies, they're getting a D tier. Every single enemy I've talked about and I'm going to talk about have hands, but none have hands like these hands. The first one is literally called Hand. They emerge from the ground and grab you, but you don't take any damage from it. They just serve to either slow you down or make you get hit by surrounding enemies, which in of itself is a neat added challenge. The Claw are just like the Ghost, but worse from a challenge perspective. They're slow and easy to hit. The Wall Hands are traps. They stay in place like a stationary enemy, but if you get caught by them, the Skeletal Knight that's guarding those hands will attack you. Thanks to the Crouch Walk, you should never get hit by this enemy ever. The Hand is going to get a B tier. This enemy has merit assisting other enemies efficiently. Plus I think they look better than the Claw, which I think is going to get a D tier. They're not very interesting. The Wall Hands are a neat idea, but they're so easy to avoid that I can only give them a C tier. Before we get into the major bosses of Castlevania IV, there's one more group of enemies I want to talk about, which are the Oddballs. Enemies that almost exclusively appear in Castlevania IV, or behave in a certain way that's only exclusive to Castlevania IV. The first enemy I'll talk about is Mr. Head, which is literally the head of a horse and named after a sitcom. These enemies are kind of neat, as in they're very unique for Castlevania standards, but they don't have much beyond their basic attack pattern. They also only appear in the first stage in one single hallway. Then there's the Needle Lizard, which reminds me a lot of Sonic. It's a hedgehog-looking creature that rolls into a ball. What do you expect? Their attack pattern's pretty basic as well, but the fact that they're invincible whenever they roll into a ball is a little interesting, I guess. Then you have the Clubbing Knight, which is supposedly a skeleton according to the Nintendo Power magazine, but then in other artwork it's a literal knight. And while it is a stationary enemy, it only appears in Castlevania IV, so it's by technicality an oddball. I like the concept for this enemy, especially since there's nice foreshadowing when you see it peeking out right before you approach it. And unlike other oddballs, this one actually appears in multiple stages. One oddball that I really like is the Viper Swarm. Like Mr. Head, they only appear in the first stage of the game in one hallway or two. And with the sprite work, it's kinda hard to tell that it's even supposed to be snakes. I do like how these enemies are on the ceiling and then drop down on you, which does mean that you have to utilize your upwards whip attack to fight them. And it's snake related, and snakes are my favorite animal, which is a plus. Then there's the Invisible Wraith, a man made of leaves. They only appear in the beginning of stage 2, but what's really interesting about this enemy is the fact that it blends in with the background. It'll pop out of nowhere and they're really fast and relentless, making them decently strong enemies for very early on in the game. I'm honestly kinda shocked that this enemy hasn't appeared in other Castlevania games, considering it's a very interesting idea for an enemy, both in attack pattern and design. Then we have the Rug Creature, which I never thought about, but is technically an enemy in this game. They're only in the library stage, and what they do is go underneath you to increase your height. And considering that they only appear when spikes are above you, that's where the challenge comes from. All you gotta do is crouch or crouch walk, and you're good. It's an interesting idea, but not really much you can do with it. And our final oddball is the Larva, which by technicality isn't an oddball based off its appearances, but more so its behavior. The Larva does make its debut in Castlevania IV, but only in the library stage. It only appears in one hallway, and when you off-screen it, a weird noise occurs and then it's just gone. In actuality, if you defeat this enemy, you're rewarded a lot of points which can help you get a 1-up. It's such a random bonus type of enemy to have in the game, but I really love it for that. Now as I mentioned, this isn't the only time the larva appears. In its other appearances, it appears as a regular enemy, such as Rondo of Blood or Portrait of Ruin. But in this specific case, it's a one-time thing, and it's very niche, and you know, it's kinda hard to kill. I was only able to do it because I had triple shot cross, but trust me, this thing does take a while, and it eventually goes away anyway if you fail. Mr. Head is gonna get a C tier. I like the quirkiness of how random this enemy is, but it doesn't really do much beyond that. The Needle Lizard is also gonna get a C tier. I like this enemy, but it doesn't really compare to the rest of the Rogues gallery in Castlevania IV. The Clubbing Knight is an interesting idea of a stationary type of enemy, and I do like its design. It reminds me a lot of Kid Chameleon. This one's gonna get a B tier. Not terribly interesting, but above average. The Viper Swarm may not be necessarily interesting to most of you guys, but I love snakes, so I'm giving it an S tier because I'm biased, I don't care. I'm also gonna give an S tier to the Invisible Wraith. It's an interesting idea, and I think camouflage-based enemies can work as long as it's well designed, and in this case I think it is. The Rug Creature's gonna get a D tier. I think it's very interesting, but when you compare it to other enemies, it just doesn't compare. And then the Larva's gonna get an S tier just for being so bizarrely random. It's got a cool design, and trying to kill it to get all those points or just a flex is very fun in every playthrough. Last but certainly not least, we have the major bosses you encounter at the end or middle of all the stages. Bosses in Castlevania are easily some of the most iconic parts of any of the games. Castlevania IV does have some veterans like Medusa or Frankenstein's monster, but Castlevania IV also has its fair share of some interesting and unique bosses that only appear in this game. Our first boss, Rodane, being an example. Rodane is a skeleton on a horse, and he's incredibly easy, which is appropriate given he's the first boss of the game. He loses the horse once you take out half of his health bar. On his final hit, he'll sort of fake you out by spreading his body apart, and then reforms to his usual attack pattern. I do like how this boss does try to do something unique compared to other first bosses, but it's still a simple boss fight, so Rodane's gonna get a C tier. Next is our first veteran, Medusa. She can petrify you, and she does look pretty cool, but it's so fucking funny how quickly she falls apart with triple shot cross. In fact, if you're good enough, you could defeat her before the boss music properly starts. I'm a bigger fan of more dynamic takes on her boss fights like in Portrait of Ruin. For Castlevania IV specifically, she's gonna get a B tier. The Orphic Vipers return from their debut in Castlevania III. In Castlevania IV, they're larger and more threatening. Thanks to your range, you can attack them safely at a distance, and if you got axe or cross with double or triple shot, you're pretty much guaranteed to win the fight. I've always had a soft spot for the Orphic Vipers. I love their design, and sadly they don't appear in many titles. And while you can argue the Rondo of Blood battle is more dynamic, I prefer Castlevania IV's iteration of this boss. This is also possibly biased because I love snakes and they're snake related, but they're gonna get an S tier. Medusa is snake-like obviously, but her boss fight is way more standard in comparison to the Orphic Vipers. Next we got Huexel. Not only is this a cool skull enemy mummy that ends up appearing in future titles known as the Man-Eater, but it's getting an S tier automatically for its name. Huexel is backwards for licks you up, and I fucking love that. Coronat is kind of messy. His design isn't terribly interesting, and his boss fight is a bit hectic. Warning if you're sensitive to lights or have a history with seizures because attacking him can suck. He flashes white whenever you hit him, which isn't too bad unless it's on a big ass screen. Like Huexel, he has a name that translates into something backwards. Coronat being Tunarok backwards. I'm not really big on this boss, so he's gonna get a D tier. I think an example of a more interesting golem boss would be Haunted Castle in its remake. Remember how I said that the Ghost Dancers have more intricacy when it comes to the boss encounter? That boss would be the Ghost Specters. This phantasmic duo dances around the area and attacks you with a synchronized fencing attack. Something about the idea behind this boss and its atmosphere was always among one of my favorite boss encounters in the whole game, so it easily earns an S tier. Sir Grackle is pretty odd. Just a random ass knight that's a boss in this game only. I like his design and how he moves, and his attacks are pretty cool and nice looking, even if he is a simple boss. Sir Grackle does gain bonus points for being exclusive to Castlevania IV, but the best he's gonna get is a B tier. Frankenstein's monster is also a boss here, but this is definitely one of the more simple encounters in the series. He doesn't have a hunchback fighting alongside him, nor does he do any of those cool electrical attacks in Bloodlines, or even that spin dash shit in Symphony of the Night. He throws potions at you and makes the ground shake. That's it. In fact, the real challenge of the boss fight comes from the Vegas bridge right before it. Frankenstein's monster gets a C tier. The Zapf bat is sick as fuck. Unlike your usual bat boss, this one's made of treasure and duplicates into smaller bats later on in the fight. This type of bat is exclusive to Castlevania IV and gets an S tier, mainly for the design and sprite work. The Mummy is easily an S tier. Longtime watchers know I love mummies, and of course I'm gonna love the Mummy in every Castlevania game. In Castlevania IV, he teleports and shoots bandages at you. He's really easy to corner with the whip dangle, which is fucking hilarious. He has some of my favorite animations in the game, and the fight overall is just really fun. Now we have the penultimate trio before Dracula himself. Slagra, Gaibin, and Death. Slagra is notorious in Castlevania IV for being considered one of the hardest, if not the hardest boss in the entire game. His strategy is deceptively simple. When you hit him, he will explode and fly up, landing on the opposite side. What makes this boss difficult is his frame data and randomness factor. Sometimes he'll lunge at you frame 1, giving you no time to react or try to avoid the attack. His collision detection is so jank it can make Smash Ultimate blush. While the boss is somewhat unfair in that department, the fact he's so notorious and genuinely cool looking brings him to S tier. Slagra is iconic for better or worse, but I think that his notoriety and challenge works in his benefit for the most part. Gaibin, while not a pushover, is not too difficult. He's not so bad thanks to your upward whip attacks. When he's down to half of his health, he'll grow red and act more aggressive, shooting way more fireballs at a time. He's a pretty cool boss, and both him and Slagra are notable for being the first boss encounters in Symphony of the Night, acting exactly how they did in Castlevania IV. Slagra and Gaibin are an iconic pair, but while Slagra gets an S tier, Gaibin's only gonna get an A tier. He's less interesting when you compare him to Slagra, not by too much, but just enough to lower his rank. The last boss before Dracula is of course his right-hand man, and his bony bestie, the Grim Reaper himself. Death in Castlevania tends to be pretty easy in each game. Need I mention how he's skippable in Simon's Quest? But the only time he was really truly difficult was in Castlevania 1. That is assuming you didn't just spam triple shot holy water like everyone else. Even when they recreate this fight in Castlevania Chronicles, it's basically night and day compared to the NES original fight since you could just war of attrition it. In Castlevania 4, his encounter feels like a nice balance of challenge and fairness. His scythe attacks aren't too bad to deal with, though I didn't realize holding my whip up can cheese them, so that's a good tip for you in this fight. What I love especially is that they acknowledge the fact that the sub-weapons cheese Death in Castlevania 1, so what they do is have a phase where all the sub-weapons you can use are nullified. That is something you almost never see in bosses, especially given bosses being cheesed are usually due to the sub-weapons being spammed. His design is great, and my only downside is the lack of a second form, something that started in Castlevania 3 and would eventually be the norm in future titles. Regardless, Death is just too iconic not to put into S tier. Lastly, we have the man himself, Dracula. Dracula is the final encounter in every classic Castlevania game, so thematically he should feel the most grand. And Castlevania 4 knocks it out of the park with this fight. It's similar to Castlevania 1 where he teleports and shoots projectiles at you, but Dracula has such a nice variety of attacks. He's got these flame faces that can harm you upon death, and even a projectile that heals you if you hit it right, though admittedly I always struggle with this. My favorite attack is the electrical one during the second phase. What I love is that these attacks are devastating, but telegraphed well to not feel cheap. The whole fight is great as Dracula's main theme is fantastic, but when he's low on health, Simon's theme kicks in, and it's just so good. It's like the tides turned and now you're you're the one dominating. When you finally defeat Dracula, you get this awesome death animation of him forming into little bats, burning one by one from the exposed sunlight. It's simply perfect. And if you do have trouble with this fight, there's of course the secret staircase with that 100 heart triple shot chicken combo meal. Easily one of the best Dracula encounters in the entire series. The fact that Dracula doesn't have a second form doesn't really bother me, honestly. Sure, the second forms can be pretty cool or creative in some cases, but I don't think it's necessarily needed to have a cool Dracula fight. The design of Dracula, the attacks, the music, the room the battle takes place in, the atmosphere, would anyone even debate a tier other than S tier? And there you have it, my personal tier list on every single enemy and boss you encounter in Super Castlevania IV. Super Castlevania IV continues to be my favorite classic Castlevania game for many reasons, and the amazing enemies are no exception. Whether they are returning enemies or newcomers, the enemies you face in Castlevania is such a big reason on why the games are so fun. Some enemies like the zombies or bats may not seem too interesting, but even they have their fun variations in other titles. And in Super Castlevania IV specifically, even if the enemy is simple, the atmosphere that they carry shows that it wouldn't be Castlevania without them. If I were to do another video about Castlevania enemies for one specific game, it would easily be Symphony of the Night. That game has loads of fun and creative enemies that I can't wait to talk about someday, and maybe at some point I'll rank every single boss in the entire franchise and determine which version of said boss is the best one. If you haven't played Castlevania IV, I heavily recommend it. If you're trying to get into the series, it's a great entry point, but as always, I'm curious of what you guys think. What did you guys think of this tier list? Do you agree with my rankings, or do you think some enemies deserved higher or lower? Also, out of curiosity, what's your favorite Castlevania IV enemy and boss? I appreciate you guys for stopping by, and as always, happy night hunting.